Hi, and welcome back to GCSE History Lessons. In this lesson, we will look at the ambitions of the leaders of the Grand Alliance and the European theatre of World War II after the invasion of Normandy. By the end of the lesson, you should be able to understand the motivations and personalities of Winston Churchill, Joseph Stalin, and Franklin Roosevelt. You should also be able to describe the political and territorial situation in Europe by May 1945. You will remember from last lesson that the Grand Alliance was an alliance between the USA, UK, and USSR, who were fighting against Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany, as well as Fascist Italy during World War II. You will also remember that at the 1943 conference in Tehran, the UK and USA had agreed to invade Nazi Germany, and the USSR agreed to invade Japan in order to win the war. The members of the Grand Alliance stuck to their promises and helped each other during the latter half of World War II. On June 6, 1944, the USA and UK invaded Normandy in France with 156,000 troops, keeping to their promises made to Stalin at Tehran. Now fighting on two fronts, Hitler's armies began to be pushed back. By late 1944, victory for the Grand Alliance seemed more and more certain, and their attention turned to how the world should look after the war. But each leader had a different vision for this post-war world. UK Prime Minister Winston Churchill and USSR leader Joseph Stalin were pragmatic leaders, concerned with the power and security of their own nations after the war. Churchill wished to hold on to Britain's colonial empire and use its resources to rebuild Britain's economy. Meanwhile, Stalin wanted to create a buffer zone of friendly countries between his Russia and the Western European countries, especially Germany, which had invaded Russia twice during Stalin's lifetime. Stalin also wanted to encourage communist revolutions in other parts of the world. These ambitions led him to withhold the Red Army from attacking Nazi-occupied Poland until the Nazis had destroyed the Polish Home Army and its nationalist supporters. He hoped that Poland would become an important Soviet-friendly buffer state between the USSR and Germany. Stalin was also determined that Germany should pay for the costs suffered by the USSR throughout the war. During the war, 93% of Nazi casualties were inflicted by the Soviets, and Soviet losses far exceeded British and American losses. In the 3-year siege of Leningrad, Russian deaths were more than those of America and Britain combined for the whole war. In October 1944, Churchill and Stalin met at the Fourth Moscow Conference, where they divided Eastern Europe, now under Soviet control, into regions of influence. In what became known as the Percentages Agreement, it was agreed that Stalin would have 90% of the influence over Romania and 80% over Bulgaria. Yugoslavia and Hungary would be split 50-50. Meanwhile, the UK would have 90% influence in Greece. Churchill called it the Naughty Document, which excluded Roosevelt, who would have been appalled by the power-grabbing displayed by his allies. US President Franklin Roosevelt was more idealistic in his motivations. Without the need to rebuild his nation, Roosevelt wished to end old European ideas of empire and power politics, which had led Europe into 2 world wars. He also wanted to promote democracy, free trade, and civil rights all over the world, especially those countries under Soviet control. Despite the agreement with Stalin, Churchill was suspicious of Stalin and hated communism. Both he and Roosevelt were eager to see democratic elections in Soviet-occupied territories in Eastern Europe. All three agreed that Nazis should be convicted of war crimes. But there was little agreement on what to do with German territory after the Nazis finally surrendered. This was especially true since both the USA and UK in the West and the USSR in the East were now closing in on Germany. Without an agreement on the fate of Germany, it seemed that the fastest to reach German territory would gain the most. In February 1945, the Big Three decided to meet at Yalta to reach an agreement on the division and possible reunification of Germany, as well as multiple other issues. This conference will be discussed in more detail in the next lesson. For now, it's enough to know that at Yalta it was agreed that Germany and Berlin would be divided into various occupation zones controlled by the Big Three, until further agreements could be made on German reunification. This spurred Stalin forces on to take Berlin while more forces pushed deeper into German territory. US and USSR forces met at Leipzig near the Elbe River on April 25, 1945, while the Nazi forces in Berlin surrendered on May 2nd. Hitler was finally defeated on May 7, 1945, ending the war in Europe. Germany was divided into occupation zones as agreed, and so was Berlin, which was 100 miles within Soviet territory. So, to summarise what we've learned today, Churchill was a pragmatic leader determined to secure the power of the UK in the post-war world. He wanted to retain Britain's empire and its influence over countries such as Greece. Stalin was a ruthless and paranoid leader who wanted the USSR to remain powerful and secure after World War II. He wanted to spread communism and create a buffer zone of friendly satellite states in Eastern Europe. Stalin and Churchill made the Percentages Agreement in October 1944 to divide Eastern Europe into spheres of influence for the UK and USSR. Roosevelt was an optimistic and idealistic leader who wanted to ensure another world war would not happen. He wanted to build a new international system based on free trade, civil rights, and democracy. At Yalta in February 1945, the Big Three agreed to divide Germany and Berlin into occupation zones after the war. They then raced to defeat the Nazis. Stalin's Red Army reached Berlin first and pushed further into Germany. The war in Europe ended with Berlin situated 100 miles within the Soviet zone. Next lesson, we will take a closer look at the outcomes of the Yalta Conference. Thanks for watching. Feel free to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time on GCSE History Lessons.